Before the world associated Sandra Lee with viral dermatology videos and primetime television, she was simply a physician building a life through repetition, discipline, and quiet commitment. She trained in dermatology not for spectacle or recognition, but because she was drawn to a field where science meets something deeply human: identity, confidence, and vulnerability. In a modest practice in Upland, California, she saw patients whose concerns were rarely just medical. Skin conditions often carried emotional weight, shaping how people saw themselves and how they believed the world saw them. That awareness shaped the way she practiced medicine. She listened closely, explained gently, and treated every case as more than a diagnosis. There was no brand, no audience, no performance. Just a doctor showing up every day, doing work that most people never see but many people depend on. In those early years, nothing suggested viral fame was waiting. And yet, the foundation of everything that would later define her public identity was already being built quietly in exam rooms where trust mattered more than attention, and where empathy was as important as expertise in every single interaction she had with her patients. A specialty few chose and a perspective few understood. Dermatology, for Sandra Lee, was never just about treating skin conditions in isolation. It was about understanding the intersection between physical symptoms and emotional experience. Many of her patients arrived carrying embarrassment, anxiety, or long-held insecurity. Conditions that might appear medically routine often carried years of social discomfort behind them. She learned early that healing in dermatology often required more than procedures or prescriptions. It required dignity. This perspective set her apart even before she ever appeared on screen. She spoke to patients in a way that removed shame from the conversation, replacing it with clarity and calm. Over time, her clinical skill and emotional intelligence became inseparable parts of her practice. She wasn't building a following, but she was building trust at a level that many physicians never reach. Each patient encounter reinforced her belief that medicine was not just technical work, but human work. Long before any audience existed beyond her clinic walls, she had already developed the communication style and emotional sensitivity that would later resonate with millions. What she could not yet know was that this quiet, consistent way of practicing medicine would eventually translate into a global form of connection she never intentionally sought but naturally embodied. The moment medicine met an unexpected audience. When social media began shifting from casual sharing to global storytelling, Sandra Lee found herself observing rather than participating at first. The idea of recording medical procedures for public viewing was unconventional, even uncomfortable within traditional medical circles, but she noticed something important. People were curious not out of shock alone, but out of a desire to understand. There was a gap between what doctors did and what patients imagined, and that gap often created fear. Her decision to begin filming was not driven by ambition for fame, but by a quieter instinct to educate and demystify. The early videos were simple, unpolished, and direct. No elaborate editing, no dramatic framing, just the reality of dermatological work presented with clarity and respect. What surprised her was not that people watched, but how they watched. They stayed, they shared, they returned with questions, appreciation, and sometimes emotional responses they did not expect. The content became less about procedures and more about relief, curiosity, and connection. Without intending to, she had stepped into a new kind of public space where medicine became storytelling, and where transparency replaced distance. The audience did not just observe her work, they began to trust it. From online curiosity to cultural phenomenon. As her videos gained traction, something unusual happened. The audience expanded beyond medical curiosity into emotional engagement. People who had never thought they would watch dermatological procedures found themselves returning repeatedly. There was something grounding in the experience, something that balanced discomfort with reassurance. Rather than sensationalizing her work, Sandra Lee maintained a steady, respectful tone that kept the focus on patients and outcomes. This approach distinguished her from typical viral content. She did not perform for attention, she worked with consistency, allowing the authenticity of the process to carry the narrative. Eventually, the reach of her content grew beyond what any individual platform could contain. Television networks noticed the organic engagement and the unusual loyalty of her audience. This led to the creation of a show that would bring her work into millions of homes. Yet even as visibility increased, the core of her presence remained unchanged. She was still a doctor first, guiding patients through vulnerable moments with care. What had changed was the scale of observation, not the nature of her intention. She had become a public figure without altering the private sincerity that had brought her there in the first place. Building a brand without losing the human center. With the success of her television presence and expanding digital influence, Sandra Lee entered a phase of professional multiplication. A skincare line, continued media appearances, and sustained medical practice created a multi-layered career that few physicians ever experience. Yet what made her trajectory unusual was not its expansion, but its continuity of tone. Whether in a clinic, on camera, or speaking in interviews, her communication remained consistent, calm, grounded, and focused on real human experience rather than abstract branding. This consistency helped her avoid the fragmentation that often accompanies public careers. She did not reinvent herself to fit new platforms. She extended the same identity into different formats. Behind the scenes, however, maintaining this balance required discipline. Each layer of visibility added expectation, and each expectation carried emotional weight. Still, she remained anchored in the same principle that guided her early career. The patient experience mattered most. Even as her name became widely recognized, she resisted turning her work into performance. Instead, she allowed the natural emotional reality of her practice to shape how the world perceived her, rather than adjusting herself to meet external demands. Health, vulnerability, and the decision to speak openly. In 2019, Sandra Lee faced a personal turning point when she was diagnosed with breast cancer. The diagnosis introduced a reality that no professional success could insulate her from. Rather than retreating entirely from public view, she chose to speak about her experience openly. This decision reflected the same philosophy that had guided her career, removing stigma through visibility. She discussed her genetic risk, the medical choices she made, and the emotional complexity of navigating treatment while maintaining a public presence. The transparency was not performative. It was consistent with how she had always approached difficult subjects. What made her openness resonate so strongly was not just the information she shared, but the emotional honesty behind it. Many viewers saw their own fears reflected in her words and felt encouraged to take action in their own lives. Screenings were scheduled, conversations were started, and silence was replaced with awareness. At the same time, she experienced firsthand the physical and psychological toll of treatment. Recovery was not linear, and public life did not pause. She moved through both healing and visibility simultaneously, carrying private difficulty while continuing to appear composed in public spaces. Shifts in the personal landscape behind the public image. As her professional life remained highly active, changes in her personal world unfolded more quietly. Her long marriage, once seen as a stable foundation alongside her career, began to shift in ways that were not publicly detailed or dramatized. There was no dramatic announcement, no public confrontation, only the gradual emergence of distance that often characterizes long relationships undergoing transformation. In contrast to her usual openness, she chose privacy during this period, allowing certain aspects of her life to remain outside public interpretation. For someone known for transparency, this silence was noticeable. It suggested a boundary she had not previously emphasized. Not everything needed to be shared in order to be real. Her audience, accustomed to her presence, sensed the change but responded with concern rather than intrusion. This phase highlighted an important truth about public figures. Visibility does not eliminate the need for personal space. Instead, it makes that space more difficult to maintain. Navigating this balance became part of her evolving identity, as she learned to distinguish between what served others and what needed to remain protected for her own stability and emotional clarity. Midlife reflection and the question of direction. Reaching her mid-50s, Sandra Lee found herself at a natural intersection of reflection and continuation. Professionally, she was still highly active, with ongoing television production, medical practice, and brand development. Yet internally, the accumulation of experience, health challenges, career expansion, and personal transition created a different kind of awareness. This was not a crisis of success, but a deeper question about alignment. What remains meaningful after decades of achievement? What continues to feel authentic rather than habitual? These questions did not arrive as dramatic revelations, but as quiet considerations embedded in daily life. In interviews and public appearances, her tone reflected this shift. She spoke less about expansion and more about sustainability, less about visibility and more about intention. There was no rejection of her past work, but a refinement in how she engaged with it. The urgency of earlier years gave way to a more measured presence. This stage of life was not defined by stepping away from her career, but by stepping more consciously into it, with a clearer understanding of boundaries, priorities, and personal cost. A career that continued while perspective deepened. Despite personal changes, her professional output did not diminish. The television show continued, her digital presence remained strong, and her medical practice maintained its rhythm. What changed was not the structure of her work, but the internal relationship she had with it. She approached patients and audiences with a sense of steadier perspective, shaped by lived experience rather than purely professional identity. Procedures were still performed with precision, but her reflections around them carried additional depth. She spoke more frequently about resilience not as a performance, but as a daily practice. She emphasized care in a broader sense, physical, emotional, and psychological, framing health as something integrated rather than isolated. This evolution did not shift her away from her core work, it refined how she understood it. Her presence became less about discovery and more about continuity. The audience that had followed her for years began to see not just a skilled doctor, but a person whose understanding of her field had been shaped by both professional repetition and personal challenge. That combination created a perspective that felt grounded rather than idealized. The quiet strength of continuation without reinvention. By this stage in her life, Sandra Lee's story was no longer defined by breakthrough moments or rapid ascent. Instead, it was defined by continuation under changing conditions. She did not reinvent herself in dramatic ways, nor did she withdraw from public life. She remained present, but with a more deliberate sense of pacing. This form of stability is often less visible than transformation, but it carries its own kind of strength. Continuing to show up after health challenges, personal transitions, and years of visibility requires a sustained internal commitment that is not easily captured in headlines. Her work retained its emotional core, helping people confront conditions they had long avoided and rediscovering confidence in the process. What had changed was the emotional weight she carried while doing it, and how she managed that weight with increasing awareness. There was no final version of her career being revealed, no concluding act being performed. Instead, there was a life continuing in real time, shaped by accumulated experience rather than singular milestones. The absence of reinvention became its own statement about endurance, identity, and the evolving nature of purpose. A story still in motion, not meant to conclude. At 55, Sandra Lee's life does not resolve into a simple narrative of success or struggle. It exists instead as an ongoing balance between public contribution and private evolution. Her influence remains visible in the millions who continue to engage with her work, whether through television, digital platforms, or clinical practice. Yet the most important aspects of her story are not found in metrics or visibility. They are found in the quieter outcomes. Patients who feel less ashamed, viewers who seek medical care they once avoided, and a broader cultural shift toward openness about conditions that were once hidden. Her journey reflects the complexity of building a life that exists both within and beyond public view. It also reflects the reality that identity is not fixed, even when it is widely recognized. What remains consistent is her orientation toward care, communication, and presence. There is no final chapter here, no definitive conclusion that ties everything neatly together. Instead, there is continuity. A life still unfolding, still adjusting, still engaged with the same fundamental question that has always defined her work: how to help people feel more seen, more understood, and less alone in their own bodies and experiences.